CITP is that kind of place where you can have people for whom tech policy is the core of their work.
It was already clear that we needed joint degrees in technology and policy.
We're going to have to navigate a lot of these issues with international partners around the globe.
Almost everything is beyond your control in terms of outcome.
We don't have a theory.
I think we're underestimating how much our policymakers are not on board.
As Dean, I have been committed to ensuring that our curriculum and programming remain relevant and forward-thinking.
Let's get started. I hope you enjoyed those brief 2 minutes of getting to stretch your legs. Jean is outside ushering people back in who left the room. It's my pleasure to welcome the Dean of the School of Public and International Affairs, Amani Jamal. We're so glad you're here today. Dean Jamal is a political scientist by training. She also directs the workshop on Arab political development, and she is the former president of the Association of Middle East and Women's Studies. She has been such a supporter of CITP, and we're very grateful for that. And under her leadership, SPIA has also launched SPIA in DC, which you heard a little bit about this morning. So we're lucky to have her speak to us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon. I am Amani Jamal. I'm the Dean of the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. It's such a tremendous honor to be here. It is my pleasure to be part of this tech policy conference. My special thanks to my colleague, Arvind Narayanan, and Tidhi Chattopadhyay, and everyone at the Center for Information Technology Policy for their outstanding work in general and in particular on this amazing event. Thank you so much. With a lineup of speakers that they put together, including, of course, FCC Chair Jessica Rosenworcel, whom you just heard from, my thanks to her and to everyone who is sharing their perspectives with us today. Besides all the great speakers, it's wonderful to have the CITP representation, as well as Princeton SPIA's own Zach Vertin, our director of the SPIA in DC Center, Zeynep Tufekci, and our colleague Zeynep Tufekci, and our former Dean Anne-Marie Slaughter as well. Technology is already a huge part of our lives in our society, and it's only going to increase. That's why your focus on the next 10 years of tech policy is so important. As Dean, I have been committed to ensuring that our curriculum and programming remain relevant and forward-thinking, and today's conference is an outstanding example of this. At Princeton SPIA, we train the next generation to be effective policymakers and shapers of a more just world, giving our students the tools to analyze and understand the many challenges and opportunities of technology is critical as we send them into the world to affect positive change around so many fields. The Center for Information Technology Policy has been an important partner to the school in these efforts. Its research and programming have informed not only tomorrow's policymakers, but also today's. CITP's ongoing partnership with SPIA and DC to provide expert analysis of artificial intelligence to the US House and Senate staffers is just one example of this. At SPIA, we like to say that public service can take many forms. A career in public interest technology is most certainly one of them. I'm grateful to CITP for showing our students the importance of effective, equitable tech policy and how they can influence it. Thanks to all of you for being with us today. I really hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Again, back to you. Well, again, Arvind and Tidhi, thank you so much. And back to you, Arvind.
Thank you, Dean Jamal. So we're going to go right into our final panel of the day. We have one slight change in the schedule. Moderating this panel will be my colleague, Mihir Kshirsagar, who leads the Tech Policy Clinic at CITP. He comes to us from a background in the New York Attorney General's office, and Zeynep Tufekci, who was going to moderate the panel, will actually be on the panel because one of our panelists unfortunately couldn't make it today because of a last-minute family issue. But I'm sure that this is going to be such an exciting discussion. So let's welcome Mihir and the panelists.
Hello, everyone. Really excited to have this panel of outstanding people talking about theories of change. And so before I introduce them, I thought I'd just say a word or two about what theories of change are to help the panel think through what they're going to respond to, and then also to take questions as you're thinking about them, questions for you to be asking. And so theories of change is a kind of, I would say, nonprofit world lingo that's come about, but effectively it's asking, how do you want to make the change you want to see? What is your strategy? What are the preconditions you may need? What are the outcomes that you're trying to achieve? And perhaps most importantly, how do you measure whether you're making success against those outcomes? And so different people have different theories of change, whether you can think of whether it's a legislative strategy, an enforcement strategy, whether you're thinking about it as a private enterprise. So there are many different ways that you can try to bring about the change you want to make. We have assembled here a group of people who've done an amazing set of interventions in the world of public interest technology. How have they constructed their theories of change? So I'd like the panel to reflect both on sort of their own personal journeys to making, how do they come about their theories of change, as well as their collective, how are the groups that they've been part of, how have they thought about it? So that's one axis of questions. And another axis of questions is for them to reflect back on themselves, what drove them in their past, but also to prognosticate, to tell us how they can think about it in the future. So these are some basic themes to talk about, but it is so wonderful to have this group who are all in some way or the other affiliated with CITP. So we have Chloé Bakalar right in the middle there, is the chief ethicist at Meta. And before she joined Meta, she was a postdoctoral fellow between us at CITP and the University Center for Human Values. So we're delighted to have her. Next, just right next to her is Pablo Chavez. He's a senior fellow at the New American Security and Technology and National Security Program, but he's of course the member of the grade class, and it actually does not have me on the notes here which year, but I'll leave it to you to decide which grade class of Princeton Pablo is part of.
Am I supposed to say?
You can say it if you.
Great class of 93.
93. And is a lawyer, did work for the Senate, and then also worked in public policy for LinkedIn, and then later on for Google Cloud. Next to Chloé is Zeynep Tufekci, who we're delighted to come back to CITP. It's a full circle. She's obviously a professor at SPEAR and a public intellectual. Many of you have read her columns in the New York Times. But Zeynep has got her start, as I've heard you say, and I'd be delighted to hear how that played a role in your theory of change, but got her start as a postdoctoral fellow at CITP. And then finally, at the end, we have Gabriel Weinberg, who's the founder of DuckDuckGo, and represents, I think, a really powerful way of thinking about interventions in the market when you actually create a company that goes from, I think, a startup which was primarily self-funded to now a very successful and important competitor in a market that unfortunately remains highly concentrated. So we have this great panel, just like you, to reflect on sort of these prompts to think about it, and then I'll ask more questions as we go along. So Pablo, over to you.
First of all, you're doing a great job as the understudy so far. Well done. Secondly, available bookstores everywhere. This is why I was invited. It's a wonderful book. I expect to get it signed after the panel. So hi, everybody. I'm Pablo Chavez. As Mihir mentioned, I am currently an adjunct senior fellow with the Center for New American Security. I also serve on the board of the Open Technology Fund, which funds anti-censorship technology in countries of concern, specifically. And I also work separately with NGOs and corporations on their policy strategies as they relate to, kind of current issues like AI and in cloud computing. It's wonderful to be here, and I know that we're talking about the future of technology, the next 10 years, but I do think that we need to take a moment to celebrate CITP in its current moment right now. I'm on the advisory committee of CITP, and I've been doing that for over 10 years. And it is always impressive and inspiring to meet with students at CITP and to see what the future holds in the present of the student body. So it's just a remarkable experience. I first experienced CITP under Ed's leadership, which was wonderful then. Now under Arvind, I just see a tremendous amount of growth and an evolution and an influence. So it really is just an honor to be here. And again, just to celebrate the moment that we're in right now. I started my policy career in the Senate. I was a senior staffer in the Senate Commerce Committee. You might be surprised to know that I actually worked with Jessica, who was giving me PTSD as she was talking, because it's like, oh my God, this is just so smart, and I'm so intimidated. I have to go up on the stage afterwards, so here I am. But that was my start in policy. I then moved on to be chief counsel of Senator John McCain, and then moved into the private sector as an executive in the policy operations of Google, then LinkedIn, then Microsoft, then back to Google. That is the primary source of kind of my professional training in policy. And really, I think what I wanted to focus on briefly, I'm going to follow the path of Paul Ohm and basically talk about what I want to talk about, which is just providing a little bit of advice for people who are thinking about entering into the tech policy world, as well as potentially kind of enhancing and expanding their role in the policy world. For me, the private sector experience has been very interesting. Again, I'm now kind of ex-Google, et cetera. But it's given me a chance to reflect, and I realized that the corporate training has really kind of been instrumental in terms of kind of like the skill set and the perspectives that I've developed over the course of my career. In part, and for those of you who are thinking about policy as part of a corporation, in part because policy doesn't quite fit into companies the way that other disciplines do, right? So it's not marketing, it's not advertising, it's not product, it's not finance, it's not really legal. It's something else, and so when you do policy for a company, you really kind of need to have essentially kind of like an operating model of sorts, a mental model of what precisely it is that you're doing. Because if you're doing it for the reasons that I did it, which is that I actually have a sense of kind of what policy should look like, what the future of tech policy should look like. There's a normative element to this. You're not just selling, right? You're not just doing business development or anything like that. So you really need to kind of define what it is that you are within the organization. And with that in mind, I just wanted to kind of give three very quick ways of thinking about the job in your career in public policy. Again, from the perspective of somebody who's kind of been doing what I've been doing for about 20 years. So first, essentially kind of there are three things that I would like you to think about. The environment that you're operating in and that you will be operating in, who you are in that overall environment, what persona you have, what role you have, and then finally kind of like what your North Star is, what guides you. So I'll go through those really quickly. The first is the environment that you're in. Some people think about this in terms of kind of the world of relationships that you have. And certainly that involves kind of meeting the right people, engaging with senators and staffers and all these things. But it really is about kind of like understanding the relationships of the operating environment that you're in, understanding what, for example, what is the Federal Communications Commission, what is the Federal Trade Commission, what is the role that they play, and that is a critical part of the job, really understanding that ecosystem. Because at the end of the day, when you're doing policy, what you're trying to do is basically take an idea that you think would be good for the world and actually make it into reality, either via legislation, regulation, voluntary principles, a corporate policy, and so forth. And so if you understand your environment, you're able to understand how to navigate it and really how to kind of how to operate in the value chain, in the supply chain of policy. So that's the first thing that I would ask you as you're thinking about a career in this space to think about. The second is kind of what you are. And there's a lot of options about what kind of role you can take on and what persona you can have as a public policy professional. My preferred way of approaching it is what a professor from University of Michigan, John Kingdon, came up with in the 1980s, which is the idea of a policy entrepreneur. And that model has served me tremendously well because it really has given me, I think, a sense of agency and a sense of like being really responsible for the policies that I'm promoting in the tech policy space. It gives you also the additional discipline of thinking about policy, and for lack of a better way of putting it, as a product, right? So you're packaging it, you're figuring out how to communicate it, how to, for lack of a better way of putting it, advertise it, how to find the right product market fit, and who exactly you're selling this to. Is it to an agency? Is it to a legislature and so forth? So that, I think, has, whether you decide to be a policy entrepreneur or something else, it's actually really important to know what you are doing because, by the way, nobody else is really going to define it for you. So it's really kind of your responsibility. The third and last thing that I'll point out is it's really important to keep your North Star. And so the way that I have thought about this, and when I've had one-on-ones with people on my team, the way that I talk about it is essentially kind of finding the intersection of your idealism and pragmatism. And you can think about it as kind of like a supply and demand curve, and the point of equilibrium between those two curves. That is actually where action happens. By the way, it doesn't mean that point of intersection is what you should be happy with. Maybe you think about shifting one of those curves to better accomplish your goals and get closer to your North Star. But it is critically important, I think, to always kind of keep in mind what it is that you want to do and how that relates to the reality on the ground, because it is really kind of the only way that you're going to be effective and that you're going to be able to measure your own efforts in the tech policy space. This is the golden age a golden age of tech policy. There's a ton of challenges out there, but that actually means that there's also a lot of opportunities for smart, competent, well-trained, and enthusiastic and energetic people to enter into the space. It is a very, very rewarding place to be. And I would really encourage CITP folks to continue on this path. And thank you.
So my few minutes are going to be a lot less practical and helpful probably than that. So please excuse me. I'm a philosopher and an ethicist. That's kind of my excuse for it. And in fact, as an ethicist, I was very excited to talk about the logistics of how to change policy. That's a joke. It's also not really. There's not really a joke, right? Because there is actually a lot of overlap between ethics work and policy work. In fact, there's a whole subfield of ethics that we call ethics and public policy, or variations on that. And that subfield is how I ended up at Princeton in the first place as a values and public policy postdoc, and also how I ended up getting involved with CITP more years ago than I would like to admit. Now, the intersection between ethics and policy can sometimes be surprising to people and sort of on two polar directions. Like I met lots of moral philosophers, which is just another term for ethicists, whose research interests are extremely separate from the more practical, grounded world of public policy, and that's great. I've met many policy people, wonks, and also people working in companies like Meta, who treat ethics as something that maybe at worst is like a lot of just relativistic, normative, fluffy nonsense. I'm glad that the mic picked that up extra. And at best, maybe something that's kind of unnecessary, where we have laws that, naturally are the perfect embodiment of what's good and right and proper, right? So I've seen both sides of that on the policy side. Now, unsurprisingly, I take a different approach, right? At least when we're talking about applied or very practical ethics, I'd argue that ethics and policy are really at their best when they're in conversation with one another. To be extremely simplistic, we could say that AI ethics enables responsible, defensible decision-making in the spaces that the law doesn't quite cover, or doesn't cover yet, or doesn't sufficiently cover. In other words, in the world of AI, ethics and policy can be complementary functions, and that's sort of how we treat them at Meta. Unfortunately, I have a couple of my former policy colleagues who are here, are not currently here, but they would have smiled at that. Thank you. Yeah. But even more than that, I'd argue that the two are and should be sort of intimately intertwined. AI ethics is at its most impactful when it's informed by political and regulatory realities. And regulatory approaches to tech policy are improved to the extent that they take seriously normative ideals and principles around burgeoning technologies. Much of the work that I do in my role at Meta is in this intersection. And so that got me thinking, right? As I considered where tech policy is going to be in the next 10 years, and first of all, I'll say, I think 10 years is like way too long of a time horizon. When I think about what we were thinking a year ago or 2 years ago, we never could have predicted that would be where we're sitting right now. But sure, 10 years from now, when I think about what it'll be or what it should be, or how we're gonna get there, like many people here today, starting with Arvind, I couldn't help but reflect on where we were 10 years ago and how far we've come from there. And given my background, I'm going to emphasize how far we've come in making ethics a deliberate and meaningful part of the process. Spoiler alert, I don't think it's as linear as perhaps some of us might wish it to be, right? So to set the scene, 10 years ago, AI ethics was still a very fledgling, it was a new term. A few people in industry were starting to use it in 2014, but without very clear focus. So it tended to mean something like fairness, but what did fairness mean? Something like accountability, but through what kinds of mechanisms? And something around transparency, but transparent about what and how. AI ethics in this early stage also came with extremely unrealistic expectations. I can't tell you how many times I've heard, especially from industry, variations on the phrase or the sentence, right? Oh, we're gonna solve fairness in 6 months. We're gonna solve fairness in 2 years. Don't worry, we've got this fixed. Or, questions of like, what do we need to do to tie a bow on this problem and guarantee that the technology is going to be ethical, as if ethical were just a mark we could check off. But at least these people back in 2014 who are being super optimistic about it were talking about ethics, and that was a good step forward. There weren't that many people doing it, right? In the mid-2010s, AI ethics was still pretty niche. There were people who were doing AI responsibility work, such as responsible data practices, work around privacy, algorithmic bias mitigations, the early stages of that. But responsible AI or AI ethics teams within industry were still pretty rare on the ground. And in academia, AI ethics was being toyed with in some schools, some departments, but was still quite a ways away from being treated as a serious and substantive field of ethics, at least, in philosophy and political theory departments. And yet it grew, right? By the time that I joined Meta in 2019 as part of a very small team, and when I joined, literally the team was, I think, 5 people, which would eventually grow into what was our responsible AI team. By that point, many of the big tech companies were building their own responsible AI or AI ethics kinds of teams. Conferences like FACT were starting to garner increased attention. Indeed, every AI, or nearly every AI or ML conference eventually began hosting sessions on ethics. It's a pretty easy way to get a paper accepted if you wanted, or a workshop accepted. An entire industry of AI ethics consultancies popped up virtually overnight. And academic programs at the intersection of AI and ethics, like the one here at CITP, were starting to thrive. So how did all of that happen? How did it go from being this, fledgling term into something that had some bones, had a lot of attention, had a lot of people working in the field? There are probably many different explanations, right? There are certainly a lot of loud and very persistent people in academia and in the tech industry who are pushing for a more proactive and positive approach towards building and developing these new technologies. I'll say it also didn't hurt, right? That certain regulatory requirements, especially coming out of Europe and various litigations, forced tech companies to develop and demonstrate these muscles. And as the rate of technological advancement far outpaced the speed with which regulation could reasonably be passed, companies started leaning on self-regulation based on normative principles and values to help guide their impact on people, groups, and societies. But however it did come about, right, the rise of AI ethics represented a major shift in how tech and tech policy came to be. But as I say, this was certainly not a linear process. It wasn't linear in the rise, far from it. And since then, we've seen some significant contractions, right? Especially post-COVID, we've seen changes in the structure of large and small and medium tech companies. Layoffs and moves towards greater efficiency in the tech industry have meant that many of the tech companies across all sizes and across all industry, right, have reduced or redistributed their responsibility teams over the past couple of years. We might say that the pendulum, which had swung in favor of AI responsibility, started to swing somewhat backwards. Now, keep in mind, I'm incredibly biased here. I'm the chief ethicist of Meta, so I obviously think that this is a valuable role, but I will come out and say I think that this is deeply problematic for the tech industry, that we've moved somewhat away from this push towards more concerted efforts at AI responsibility, especially in the era of generative AI. Listening to Paul earlier, he argued, and I think I told Paul this, but I'll tell everyone, I very much agree with his thesis. He argued that the newest generations of AI platforms and products require a wider range of expertise than perhaps ever before. So not just engineers and computer scientists, but people from all different kinds of backgrounds with all different kinds of ways of thinking. For example, when we're thinking about the kind of content that's acceptable or not for an LLM to generate, right? These are the kinds of questions that we want to be asking constitutional scholars, philosophers of speech, and communicative theorists, along with many others. When decisions around open source AI are made, we're going to want to take into account views from economists, from securities professionals, from democratic theorists, and innovators of all different kinds. And as we start to work through the risks and the incalculable potential benefits of AI agents, the next frontier, we need people who are specializing in societal harms, in our moral obligations to others, in ideas like agency and human autonomy, and all of these extremely thorny contested issues that define disciplines in philosophy and political science, anthropology, neuroscience, physics, the wide range. These are not the kinds of problems that we're facing right now are not the kinds that can be solved purely through engineering fixes. In fact, much like fairness, they're neither really problems nor solvable in the first place, right? They're considerations that need to be understood and managed in thoughtful, deliberate ways that take into account both short and long-term impacts on people and the world. They need, to put it briefly, investment in interdisciplinary approach to tech, both by training more well-rounded engineers, but also by getting the right people at the table in the first place and keeping them there, making sure that they don't have to leave the table when the ultimate decisions are made. In other words, understanding our gaps and deficits as people and as institutions, and working proactively to fill them to enable a more holistic, global approach to AI responsibility. And this is where I'll now bring it back to policy a little bit. So, as I said, most of the important issues around AI today are neither truly problems nor definitively solvable. They're issues that we need to understand, address, and manage. But this isn't something that any one person can do. It's not something that any one company can do. It's not even something that the tech industry at large can do, right? Developing and enabling responsible AI and generative AI demands deep partnership with the public sector and with government. This isn't a single stakeholder concern. This is a multi-stakeholder concern. One way to think about it is that this means we need people working both on the outside and on the inside of industry. That means people who are pushing on tech from without, so regulators, civil society, academia. But it also means having some people inside tech companies doing this work. You sometimes hear the admonition that you can't put a fire out from inside the house. And yeah, sometimes that's true. You need firefighters to come from outside. But I like to remind people that very often the only reason that you can't put the fire out from inside is because there was no one inside who could have put it out when it was a smaller fire. So it gets big enough that suddenly you need this much larger concerted effort. And really we need all of it. So if I could leave you guys with anything, not anything practical, mind you, it's the idea that we need people working in all of these various sectors, not just to put out fires, but to make sure that they don't start in the first place.
So, hello, everyone. And it really is true. This is like full circle for me because I did start at CITP 10, 11 years ago, and I was like a research fellow when things were so less complicated that when I walked in, Laura, who was she was managing the place then, she's still here, asked me to pick an office, and the big corner office with the big windows was empty. I'm like, can I have that one? I'm like, sure, nobody's there. So I was this little nobody with this big, nice Princeton corner office. Right now, I went to the orientation meeting for the new fellows, and they literally have like the postdocs on like bunk desks almost. So I told them this. I said I had the corner office when I had your fellowship, and they just looked at me like I had grown like 17 arms and legs. And I said, really? So it was great. And I was basically not a public intellectual, any reasonable word. I just was like a struggling sociologist who was trying to talk about the sociology and the social implications of all these things. And back then, a lot of people kind of looked at it like, are you doing HCI? Is it about pixel colors? I was like, no, this is like going to change society. Well, fast forward, like nobody really questions that. So that is the good part. So I want to tell you guys a story about my first, like what I got to do because I was at CITP, which was a wonderful opportunity. And some details of it I learned somewhat recently, which I think is very telling on how change does and does not happen. And it's going to actually go back to the idealism, realism question, but from a very different perspective. So back then, I think this has been completely memory hold. There was a huge celebration of Facebook as having enabled Barack Obama's reelection. That was the line. There were like these, so what you would call liberal traditional media. There was books. There was like MIT Technology Review had this cover, like, what was it? Like big data will save democracy, something like that. Facebook will save, it was just seen like that. And Obama people and Facebook people were very friendly, to say the least. And after he got reelected, this actually started in the 2008 election when they started calling his election the Facebook effect. So in 2012, I landed at CITP at my wonderful corner office where I didn't have to teach like stats, methods, intro, whatever they would let me teach so that I could survive in regular academia, because what I did was seen as like, she's kind of crazy, but she's not a bad teacher for stats and methods, right? They kind of let me survive. So I had this time where I could actually do what I wanted to do, which was tech policy. And great. beautiful light in that room too. So with the sort of false encouragement I got on like what I could do, I pitched a piece. Back then they called them op-eds, now it's guest essays, to the New York Times, where I'd never published a thing, and I never thought I could, on the need to regulate things like Facebook, now that Obama had gotten elected, because as wonderful as the people who think it helped, Barack Obama's election might be, that there were things to these tools and the way Facebook worked that wasn't great for democracy. That it needed transparency, it needed accountability, micro-targeting had issues, we had no regulation, we didn't even know what was going on, and it would be sort of kind of good at least to get transparency and just sort of know where the ads were going and what things were happening and how these things. It was, I think, the mildest thing I could have written about it in sort of at the time. And my own thinking was, since Silicon Valley loves Obama and vice versa, it would be like Nixon goes to China. Like from him, the regulation would not be what I would have wanted to do, but it would have been, they would have written it. The industry would have written their own regulations. This is how it would have worked in that White House. But it would have been something. We would at least have, say, transparency. We would have some sense of how to understand this. So this little op-ed by me, whose name was unpronounceable, and I had no position, no anything. Yes, I had like the Princeton connection, but I was like, as I said, just sort of thin thread, met with a kind of backlash that I have just recently learned some more of the details that really surprised me. First, it turns out the White House was so mad. Again, like I'm nobody. They could just ignore it and that would have been the end of it. They were so mad that I have, they tried to push New York Times to publish a response, which New York Times normally doesn't, because then the op-ed pages will all be back and forth. But they really leaned so hard that they caved. I talked to the editor who basically told me the story. They said, fine, you can publish on the topic. And it's very clearly a response to me from a very high-level Obama person. I mean, you can tell, it's 2 weeks apart and doesn't name me, but it calls my op-ed malarkey and me kind of basically I'm portrayed as a crazy paranoid lady. And I'm not, you can sort of read it. My commenters hated my piece, by the way. They're like, you don't want Obama to win. What's wrong with you? And then I talked to a lot of people who were then at Facebook, where I have, as I call them, my friend enemies, because I talked to them, right? A lot of academic people. And I got told again and again by Obama people, by Facebook people, by other people, that this tool was always going to help the Democrats, that it was such a wonderful thing, that there was no way that the people that I was worried about could ever do anything bad with it. I was like, why? What makes you think this? And one of the things they told me was that, and I'm not kidding, that because these people that were not believing in climate science were data science people were all in climate science, and the Republicans didn't really believe in climate science, therefore they could never get data scientists to work for them and any of that. I was like, you've never read a history book, have you? Like money and technology. Well, this is not a solvable problem. So there was, and nothing happened. No regulation, nothing. And then we had the infamous 2016 election where arguably it was one small factor because it was a very close election. But in retrospect, arguably, obviously having unchecked lies go, wild without anybody intervening had an effect. It had some measurable effect. And that election, I think, came down to 40,000 people. So it's very plausible that you can, when it's something multi-causal. So, I mean, here, this is not about personalities. You can have the chief climate science activist that's ExxonMobil, and it'll only go so far. I mean, the people can be nice, but even the companies, tech companies, as Chloé was saying, they're shedding their teams too. They're not even really pretending that much anymore. And I'm not really blaming them, because we have to be, this is my idealism versus realism. They're companies, right? They're companies with a business model trying to survive in a complicated environment. And I have sympathy for them in some sense, because they keep going to Congress and saying, okay, tell us what to do, right? I've heard sort of the CEOs of these companies say, they don't want Congress to tell them what to do, but if somebody's going to tell them what to do, they want Congress to tell them what to do. Because how are they supposed to make these decisions, right? We are supposed to have some sort of, like, we, the people, should tell them what to do. And if we don't tell them what to do, they're going to do what they're doing now. They're just going to try either not to get regulated or get regulated in a way that is essentially, they'll try to do regulatory capture. Like you see this in the open source debate on AI, where I actually sympathize with the Facebook position, but it just happens to coincide with Facebook's market position, and OpenAI's position just happens to coincide with OpenAI's market position. Okay, like this is, I am not talking about this as a blame. I'm just kind of saying you have to be realistic. This is what companies do. So they tried to blacklist me from conferences, like the sort of the White House people and the people around them who thought, and I'm, again, like it was such an overreaction. And I've heard this since from other people, and I can publicly talk about it because one of the people who was really into hating me called me after Donald Trump got elected the day after and said, I'm sorry, like we were so harsh on you. And now I think we should have like had some at least transparency, and gave like on the record quotes to the Times and stuff about that era. So I can publicly talk about all of this. So that's sort of like how, two things here. One, CITP was so important to give me that space and time so I could just say it. I could say stuff. And I already had tenure, so all these efforts were kind of like very bizarre to me at the time. I could not understand what was going on. Like, why am I like being uninvited? What's going on? But now I'm like, this is what was going on. But that's another thing where academics, especially ones with tenure, can do. Like, we can speak on behalf of the public interest. And the worst thing that happens to us is that, you know, we don't get invited to the fancy pants conferences. And you can live with that. Because we can do something that is, I think, important. The second thing, again, that's very sort of thematic from the all these conversations we had from the morning, is that it's super hard to predict exactly where things are going to be early on. And very often the benchmarks are wrong. So if you look at the history of, say, printing press, quite relevant. They thought, the church thought it would be great for them because they could now print those indulgences they were handwriting and selling. There's a reason the initial sort of printing press stuff is like beautiful Bibles. They hand painted them to make them look like the handwritten ones, and they sort of printed indulgences. The Catholic Church thought this is the best thing ever. Well, it turned out the challengers used the printing press more to its native form, where they published these sort of cheap pamphlets, and all sorts of things happened afterwards. So the early winners and early losers are not like very nicely sort of aligned with what you think will happen. So if you look at the history of cars, when the early cars came around, the car people and geek people, okay, like car people were their geek people, and computer sciencey people are our current maybe geek people, and I'm absolutely in that tribe. We like car like individually benchmarks. So the car people were obsessed with speed. Which car is faster? Is it faster than horses? There were like these endless races with horses. They raced horses with rails too, trains. And there was a lot of concern about like cars will be clean, horses have manure. And all understandable. But arguably, if cars had never gotten past, say, 40 miles an hour, which is like a galloping horse, for some, like, imagine thought experiment, there was some like speed of light kind of thing where they couldn't go faster, we would have had, arguably, and I think we would have, at all the major things that cars have helped bring about in interaction, suburbanization, climate change, resource wars, what do these things run on, right? Like the sort of the things, the health consequences, a million things happen, but none of them were being talked about. But are cars faster than horses? Which car is faster was all people were talking about. That's how I feel about a lot of these AGI benchmarks. I'm like, my geek side is like, AlphaGo, yeah, that's so cool. But you know what? It's the scale, speed, accessibility that's going to make the difference to the social impact so much more than one line is crossed over or not. And I think that book, you're going to give us $20 each, right? Like there's a great chapter on existential risk, which I think is great. And the one disagreement I have is that I'm like, I think there are real upheaval risks here. The printing press led to events that led to like major wars that killed 30 to 40% of German population at times. which are big numbers. Like World War II is like 2% of the Europe. So the upheaval, I mean, nobody would say printing press is bad, but the upheaval was horrific. It needs to be managed. So, but if you look at the wrong benchmark, you can't manage it. I feel that way with AI, that we're looking at the wrong benchmark. We're having like the wrong nightmares. There's a lot of things that are genuinely dangerous, generally terrible, but we're not managing them. And then I'm going to pick up on one more thing you said, is that if you want to push the companies, you have to change the incentive structure. And you also have to change the technology structure. For example, Ed talked about facial recognition can be great for like unlocking your phone, but that's because there's something called the secure enclave. There's no other way I'm putting my face into anything without that technology, which makes it practically impossible for anyone to extract that biometric. So you need technological solutions that change the trade-off matrix, and you need incentives that make the companies change that trade-off matrix. The privacy-preserving technologies, privacy-preserving machine learning, all those things are like all these wonderful options. No company, not Meta, not Google, not OpenAI, is going to pursue those options unless they have to, because those are more expensive. If you want solar panels, you do not go beg ExxonMobil to be nicer. You change the taxation, you subsidize some things, you create a market, you sometimes support things till it's viable commercially, which kind of goes to your thing. And that's how you get change, right? So to do that, though, you need people who have the right nightmares, right? And I'm a very sort of optimistic human person as a person, but like the scenarios I think about what generative AI can do in terms of the upheaval, there's really horrible possibilities. None of them are Arnold Schwarzenegger coming back from the future to blow us up, but like some of them are pretty terrible nonetheless. But to have the right nightmares, you have the right people with the right understanding of the technology so that they are not fooled by either the company narratives, which are often very misleading, or the science fictionist stuff, or most of the punditry. You know, I am one of them perhaps, but like this is true. It's kind of hard to wrap your mind around a technology that you don't have that grounding in, and have the kind of approach that can also bring about it. This morning, everybody was like, we need a new science. Is it zoology? Is it biology? And I'm like, sociology? You know, this is about people. Why are we like, there are like social sciencey approaches to understanding social change at scale, where it's not about your individual benchmark as an AGI, but it is more like in the more is different kind of thing, where scale matters more, the accessibility appears more. So we need these people. And I'm going to end on something I think is the positive part. I just started teaching my like mini seminar for our sociology grad students, and it's like a small seminar. That's because that's the way they are. There's 10 students, and let me see. I think like I just had the first one yesterday. It's like 5 or 6 of them are computer science or math undergrad or MAs or MSs from places like Stanford and Yale. They could have just walked into the jobs at these companies. They clearly, very obviously, have chosen not to, which has never happened before. Like we would get like a few stray, whistleblowers, resignations, people who just couldn't take it anymore. But like it half the class is that. And part of what I'm understanding from what is happening with them is it's almost like a post-Oppenheimer moment. One of them even said it. They realize that their field is in the middle of some really downsides, some upsides for sure. Like as I said, my geek side is like all the wonderful things. But like that's fine. All the wonderful things will happen because they'll be profitable and people will do. We need to think about the sort of how do we keep that. So there's this sort of, I think, awareness in the field too with people with real good technical chops who don't want to walk into these very high-paying, lucrative jobs where they're not really helping humanity the way they think they could and they should, and are choosing to be, I think, public technologists in some sense. I don't know where they'll end up. I don't know if they'll end up in NGOs. Some of them may eventually go back to these companies or not. But there's this awareness. And there's a new crop of people. And I want to say, like, we need more of them so that we can get Congress and the FCC and FTC and everybody else to create the system that we created for food. You've heard about the E. coli outbreak, which is horrible. Killed one elderly person, bunch of people sick, McDonald's. The fact that that is a scandal rather than an everyday event is a modern miracle of infrastructure. It is very, very hard to keep mass food production from killing people all the time. In the beginning, it was killing people all the time. It's a very hard problem. It is, I mean, when people say AI is very hard, it can't be regulated. I'm like, have you ever looked at a plant inspection report of a food plant? Like, the amount of work and infrastructure and bureaucracy and rules and regulations that goes into creating a world in which you can walk into a supermarket, and if you get poisoned, it's a scandal. That's what it took. And that was a movement. It was like chemists teamed up with, I'm not kidding, the Good Housekeeping magazine to have FDA created because their children were dying from lead and titanium painted cheese and embalmed milk and all of those things. So we need that for AI. We need that, all of that for it. And this is where I end up on like where I started, which is I think CITP is such an it was early. We have as many students and postdocs as the space will now allow, now that nobody gets a corner office for free. I'm just encouraging more people to create those spaces in the academy where we can have the next generation of people for whom it's not the profit, it's not their quarterly, it's not their options, it's not their this, but it's the public interest that they can pursue and that they can inform legislatures and they can change the sort of the lawmaking process so that we have what we have for many other things that we no longer think about, where people would have told you it was impossible, but now that it works, nobody even notices it's there. We should have the same infrastructure for these new technologies, which I will immediately concede have wonderful possibilities, but also really dangerous, terrible paths or upheavals that we could all sort of suffer from. So that's the, I swear, if you come talk to me, I'm not gonna like be a pessimist. I do think that it is doable. And I feel like, final thing, education sounds great. Everyone talks about education. Like it's great for my business model, obviously as a professor, but that's not how it works. We do not make people into chemists. We do not make people have chemistry labs in their basement to make sure their food is safe. It just has to be safe. You cannot educate the public out of something like this. So having like DuckDuckGo, I think that's great. Having secure enclave, that's great. Having things where I am not worried, like, did I just miss a setting and will it blah, 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 and will this be used? Like, you cannot do this. So that kind of solution where things just work in a way that's aligned with the values we want these technologies to have, that's the future. And that future needs a lot of people on the side of the public, a lot of informed, technologically literate, scientifically literate, policy literate, sociologically literate people for whom the public interest is the priority. And I'm just hoping that this inspires, all these events inspire a lot more of these young people to come into these fields, because that's, I mean, sorry, we're like leaving this problem to them, but I think that's how we are going to move forward, and hopefully as fast as possible. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. I know we're short on time, so I'll be pretty brief. I can offer, a lot of great stuff has already been said, so I think I can offer a perspective as a for-profit, mission-driven company as a path for someone interested in tech policy to go into. I've been doing DuckDuckGo for over 15 years, but before that, I was actually a graduate student in technology policy at a place similar to CITP, which is how I ended up getting involved in it. And I saw people, going to the normal things, academia, industry, government, but not a lot of people going into small mission-driven tech companies, and partly because there just aren't a lot or weren't a lot then, which is one reason why I started DuckDuckGo in the first place. My kind of theory of change was that would be at least a high leverage thing to do because there wasn't a lot of people doing it. And I think that has proven out to be true. I think you no longer need to start necessarily a company, but joining one, I think, has a bunch of benefits that I don't think people think about often. So I just wanted to highlight a few of those as a kind of unique perspective. First off, like big companies have policy shops, but small companies usually don't. The exception is a mission-driven company. If you start a company or join a company that's mission-driven, mission is at the center of it, and so policy is usually right around the corner there. And you'll find those organizations doing stuff that academics and advocacy groups are doing and working with them, but bringing a more unique perspective. So, for example, we've drafted legislation. We've started standards, things that we wouldn't normally do, but they align with our mission. And in doing those, we found that because we're actually in the real world, trying to make things for real people, that we'll just not, if we don't do it well, we'll just go out of business, it won't work. We can test things, kind of test people's theories and our own theories, and see if they really, really work. So, you were just talking about like trying to get the big tech companies to deploy good technology, to do good things. We're on the other side of those debates all the time. And I think one of our main roles is essentially as an existence proof that you can be a for-profit company and, protect privacy or implement this or that technology without going bankrupt. And that actually carries a lot of weight because there's not a lot of companies really on the other side. So we often find ourselves in a room of like, Google and Meta and are on one side, and we're orders of magnitude smaller, but Congress and other organizations and academia are listening to us at just with the same weight because we are offering real world proof that things are happening. So that's one kind of unique perspective. Another is, and we've worked with CITP on this a little bit, a lot of these bigger companies just will not work with academia in a reasonable way, for all sorts of reasons. But, actually having real studies, like academic studies, using real world tech company data is really hard to get done. Now, it's also hard to get done from DuckDuckGo because it's a decent investment in time, and we're a small organization. But we've done a few of these now, at least one with CITP. And I think it's really meaningful to academia, really, to like have some real world data to test some of these theories. And then finally, there's like right now I'm spending a lot of time on the US v. Google case, as you might imagine. And there's all sorts of theories in that case about like what could work, what could not work. But the reality is it's a very complicated market, and most people involved have just a very narrow kind of experience into that market. Like you're an antitrust expert or, you're an economist, but you really need somebody or a company kind of like ours who can see it from all sides. And what's nice about working at like a tech company that's mission driven is not only is the mission there, but when you're making products at scale, it is completely interdisciplinary. So, you have to have good design, you have to have good data science. And as a policy person, and we employ several, they have to understand and interact with all the different parts of the company and can draw on their expertise. So you end up not having a very narrow view. You get this, I don't know other way to put it, but like real world battle tested approach where we can draw on everybody in the company, we can run experiments, and then we can go back to governments and give them, actual results. They can ask a question, we can go off and ask everyone internally, what they think about it. We can do our own research and come back with an opinion that I think is just felt and really is kind of unique in the marketplace. So anyway, that's my brief theory of change.
Great. No, thank you. Thank you very much. So in a second, I think we're going to see a slide. Yep, there we go, with questions. So please give us your questions. As these questions come in, I thought I'd start with one question for you each as panelists. You've been talking about it in different ways, about public interest, about a North Star, about how you can find your mission. How do you personally sort of benchmark your success against those goals? And what advice would you give for others who are entering this field about how to develop effective benchmarks for themselves?
I guess
we can go the other way around.
Yeah, sure. I thought the North Star, probably your comment earlier, was really resonated with me. I mean, I part of the reason I started the company is I had created this North Star of trying to make a unique positive impact. And so benchmarking on that, and I think you can do that in all sorts of ways, but the unique part was important to me in the sense that if I didn't do it, somebody else was just going to do it. Like I like the idea of doing something that really wasn't going to happen otherwise. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is just scale of impact for me is like trying to do something that really does, change something or affect a lot of people.
So in my other academic work, I study social movements. And one of the things you learn from social movement history is that you never know when things turn and how things happen because it's a very complicated system, right? So if you had, looked at the Earth Day protests in 1971, like you can literally not see the posters from the smog. And then we got the EPA shortly thereafter, actually under Nixon administration. And right now, it's remarkable how clean the US air is, relatively speaking, compared to how bad it was. I mean, we were talking about events where thousands of people would die from acute effects of bad air. And you would have said this is impossible, and then boom, it was possible. So I think like for someone like me, like it's very frustrating in some way because you do something and it just goes nowhere. And it just goes nowhere and just goes nowhere. But I feel like the right benchmark is, especially if you're in a position to speak out or try to contribute, the right benchmark is like you just have to kind of do it and not worry about when and if it's going to make an impact because you'll kind of, be very frustrated for a long time. But then things will move. And in retrospect, it'll be all those things other people did that eventually moved things. Right. So especially this is like I keep appealing, especially like for my own world when I was doing this, even before like I had tenure, I always thought like I started in computer science. Like I always thought, okay, that's my backup. Like if I really run out of academy or if I run out of, I'll just like go make living somehow. I'll just like do whatever coding or statistics. So I just thought as long as I can speak, I will speak. Now, it worked out for me career-wise. It's completely plausible. If CITP hadn't like given me that corner office, I never would have had a year and I would have been like absolutely run out of the field or the institutions. Absolutely, like just these things are luck, right? Couple of years. So thank you, people. But so the benchmark is like being on the right side of an effort. If you have that possibility, it's a super duper privilege. It's very fulfilling. It's fun. You meet nice people, but don't benchmark on impact necessarily because that can lead to huge amount of frustration. And it can also be wrong because you might be having an impact that's going to be very major in combination with lots of other people in say 2 years, but you don't know that at that moment. Nobody does and nobody can. So you just do what you can to contribute in whatever way it is. Creating like a new technological solution, sounds great. Creating new understanding, helping some senator or congressperson write better laws, just writing pieces, developing new technological solutions. I don't know, like I think all of those are great. Just don't judge yourself from like 10 years, 20 years future because you don't know.
Although I bet Pratik Mittal is watching his corner office very carefully now. Yeah, go ahead.
I need to check who has it now.
It's
and
Pratik, but go
whether
ahead.
they
Yeah,
need
Chloé.
to take some
Yeah.
long trips somewhere.
Yeah.
So I benchmark based on the nicest office. So the best office I have is myself. I'm kidding. It's
That sounds just like a great benchmark now that I think about it.
but I would say maybe three things, right? One, I would agree on the question of scale, right? So one thing that we tell ourselves at Meta, just given the scale of the company, the scale at which we do business, the billions of people and communities that are impacted, it's not about the scale of any one decision necessarily. It's that every tiny decision, even the smallest junior level engineering decision, can end up having enormous impacts. And so that's one way of sort of thinking about what success looks like, and also one way of thinking about keeping that responsibility in check. One of the first things that I did with CITP was a series of case studies from tech companies. And some of you guys will remember we did one on this scale issue. What do you do with a technology that's almost perfect, right? It's got a 0.00001% error rate, but it's deployed billions of times a day. That thinking about that, I think, is really critical. And then I would say the second one is, and this isn't a sexy benchmark, but sometimes making things less bad than they otherwise would have been is a successful benchmark, right? In an imperfect world with imperfect incentives coming from all sorts of directions, work that makes things less bad than they could have been is still a success, and I think ought to be appreciated. And then the third one, and I end up having this conversation a lot internally, is I think it's really critical that people who are working in this space take the time to really assess their own red lines, their own moral boundaries, their own values, and to do it regularly, do it often. Know what you stand for as a person, what you're willing to represent, what you're not willing to represent. And again, update that as the technology changes, as your information changes, as you evolve as a person, in order to make sure that you're always benchmarking against what you feel is the right thing to do as members of large communities, whether that's a corporation or democracy or a community group within your home. We always find ourselves in imperfect situations, so just know where your hard lines are.
So I have there's so many different ways to answer your question. So let me try a few. So if I try to answer your question based on the kind of the perspective of, for example, running a policy operation for a company or any other organization, there is actually always this question about benchmarks, and the problem is that kind of as a policy professional, you essentially kind of like live in an environment where almost everything is beyond your control in terms of outcomes, because if you think about it as a game, it's like multiplayer, multi-goal, like you're essentially kind of operating in kind of in a little bit of a state of chaos. Your managers and kind of bosses may think that you're that you're deploying some like strategy, right? But in fact, what you're constantly engaged in is kind of statecraft, really just kind of like tactics to kind of like, try to move on to, to the next role, or to the next step, and to the next step, and to the next step. And you're kind of guessing your way there. In point of fact, it's operating kind of like according to kind of like the, Niburian prayer about like, having the serenity to accept what you can't control, the courage to change what you can, and the wisdom to understand the difference between the two. In policy, that is a really, really hard thing to do, but it is tremendously necessary. To me, the fact of the matter is that you can, when you're thinking about, for example, your North Star and kind of like the reality that you're operating in, there are things that you can control in terms of kind of like what you're doing, inside of your organization, kind of like the planning that you're doing, and so forth. But everything else is just kind of like you're just kind of throwing it out there. I'll end by just giving you a quick example of what I'm talking about. So I mentioned before that I'm an adjunct fellow with a think tank called CNAS. As part of that, I've basically kind of been engaged in a project where, I've been promoting the idea of digital solidarity as an alternative to digital sovereignty, which is this kind of idea that nation states should have kind of like full control over their, technology stack and perhaps, kind of exclude kind of foreign governments, foreign entities from that stack. And so like my perspective is more one of, partnership and international cooperation. So I wrote this paper and I kind of put it out there and I kind of forgot about it. And 2 years later, the State Department cited it as the, kind of like the source of its idea for its new cyberspace and digital policy strategy. Pure luck. People think that, that I had something to do with it. I didn't. I wrote the paper, they read it. And so, so that's, to your point about randomness, it's just kind of random. And you just have to be, comfortable with that externally. But again, internally, you really do need to kind of like have, kind of a sense of purpose and a sense of goals that you're kind of keeping yourself to, as Chloé mentioned.
A lot of you have played roles where you've straddled between industry, the government, and academia. And they bring different perspectives, but sometimes you revolve between those doors. Is that a feature or is that a bug of a revolving door?
Feature.
Yeah, and why?
So until recently, I held a full-time faculty position on top of working at Meta. And for me, that was the only way that I was going to sign up to do it. First, because I thought, especially doing ethics at a big company, it's really important to have some perspective and to have some difference, right? It can be really problematic if your personal incentives become too aligned with the company's incentives, right? And so having the academic grounding and having that separation, I think provides, ideally anyway, it's not perfect, but provides a level of objectivity that's really critical to do this work in a way that one can justify and defend. Also, some of the most interesting and exciting work is happening in academia, and part of the challenge is that a lot of companies are not able or willing to bridge that divide while keeping people within academic institutions, right? A lot of companies make academics sign NDAs or inhibit their ability to publish on their findings, which makes it very challenging, especially for junior academics who need to publish this research in order to get tenure, so they can have all of the advantages that tenure affords. And so, we often see people cycling between these two worlds as a way to try and bring some of the, real world industry knowledge into academia and to bring some of the really creative, innovative, less constrained thinking and research methods of academia into tech.
Yeah. And so as you think about this, one of the questions also is obviously the pay at nonprofits is much lower. If you think about incentive structures to serve the public interest, how do you think that should be motivated, or what is your sense for how there can be more balanced perspectives on the public interest if industries, this big carrot out there, and it's hard, and that's the thing that's shaping the and there aren't that many tenured positions available. So how do you bring about the change, Pablo?
Direct? Okay.
Well, so regardless, I didn't work at industry, but I was there when, Facebook was new and Google was new and all the industry was new. And I'm my background is technical. So there's been a lot of moments where it was a plausible thing, and it was obviously would have been a lot more money. But in the end, I decided that, and I had the policy that I wasn't going to take their money, and I was able to kind of keep that going because I managed to sort of stick it out in the academy. And I would have probably, if I couldn't, I would have taken less tech jobs, meaning like not probably big companies, so I could do what I wanted to do. But that doesn't mean I didn't work with them. I work with all these companies in some sense all the time. That's why I was joking about the friend-enemy part. I have lots of friends inside these companies and various things. And usually it's the security people that are really, really interested because they're disconnected from the business model, but they see the terrible stuff most, so they really reach out. Those tend to be people I talk to a lot and in some sense kind of work with, but not really work with because I don't want to take their money. But I have found out that if you don't take any money from them, they also don't take you seriously. So I have this new thing where I ask them to make donations instead if I'm going to go talk to someone. And they're like trying to figure out how to do a purchasing order for Doctors Without Borders. It's kind of fun. So that's been like my way of dealing with it. I think it's plausible to go work with these companies, the biggest ones possible, but, and this is why I don't take the money, I think everybody underestimates how much incentives shape one's thinking. It is very, very hard to keep your mind clear when your salary, that happens to be very high, happens to be on that side. It is very hard. I'm not saying it's not possible. And I kind of hear what you're saying about like keeping the academic job. And it's just like, expecting humans to be superhumans, in my view, is not a viable thing. The incentives really matter. So it should, ideally, people should keep that in mind when they say, oh, I'm just going to work there for a couple of years and make a little bit of money and then do public interesting. I have so many friends who started that way and are now tethered to a mortgage and will never leave the company. And I'm not saying this to judge. I'm just saying they misjudged how their life would be. And I've also seen, like, it's incredibly difficult to keep one's thinking clear when the incentives are not aligned with thinking. I'm assuming you can see that. Yeah. So I keep addressing the young people. You can go into these companies, you can circulate, you can find, you need to make money, academy is tough, but don't underestimate what that will do to who you are. Like, you need to really be like guarded against what that will do to you. Yeah. So another question, Pablo, this is for you directly, but maybe Gabriel, you can talk to this as well. How do you navigate the tensions that may arise between policy teams at a company and other units such as product teams and management? What have been tools that you've used to navigate those tensions?
That is an awesome. Did that come from the audience here?
Yeah.
Or? Well done. It really kind of depends on the company. Gabriel was mentioning the value of working at a mission-driven company. I've had the privilege of working at a couple of those. One of them was LinkedIn, was very, very focused on the idea of kind of creating economic opportunity for the global workforce. It's almost inherently, kind of a public policy oriented mission. And so working with product managers, for example, in that context, with data scientists, thinking about kind of like the application of that workforce data and deploying it in support of workforce agencies, Department of Labor and so forth, to kind of inform their work, that, is fairly straightforward and fairly frictionless. It can extend even further, because when you think about, hey, you have a platform that's ultimately about jobs and, hey, it's primarily focused on white collar workers. Like, could we think about kind of applications for, kind of blue collar workers? Could we truly expand this beyond white collar so that it really is, kind of like the economic, the global workforce? So in those instances, I think that it is, that it's fairly straightforward. And I would guess that at DuckDuckGo, that relationship between policy, based on your explanation, there's a lot of similarities. There are other companies where it's different, and this is kind of, when I was talking about kind of like your environment and your role, and your North Star. There are companies that hire policy people where, as a policy person, essentially you are an extension of the sales force, right? So, for example, they might be thinking about selling into the public sector. There's some kind of policy motions that you can pursue in support of that, et cetera. And there, you have alignment, but you're not really doing policy. And so, it very much depends on the organization. You need to kind of be very, very careful, I think, about kind of like the situation that you're getting into, the role that you're going to be pursuing, and always kind of keep, again, kind of this notion of like what it is that you're trying to accomplish. Does what you're trying to accomplish actually align with the organization's goals? And if not, then, it's probably an opportunity to rethink your choice.
Gabriel, do you have any thoughts on this?
Not much to add to that. I mean, I think at the highest level, if you're, what probably Trust said, if you're aligned with kind of high level goals, or even just like the yearly strategic goals, you'll probably be in a good place. When you start to go against those, I think that's where the friction ends up being.
Yeah. And, here's another question that I think is related to some of this, which is how do you see public interest technology being defined? Who's in the room defining what is in the public interest, and who's missing from that in your view?
I don't know. I mean, I think this is related to what Zeynep was saying earlier, and I was as well. It's like, I think you need real world applications of things to showcase what's possible. Both, there's so many theories out there, and I think it's good to have theories and things to start in academia, but then you really need somebody to do it and show that it's possible and can scale up. And to be in the public interest, ultimately it needs to scale to have that impact. And so I don't know where you draw that line of where it becomes public interest technology, but you need it all. You need everything in that whole continuum. But I think what we're lacking a lot of is the implementations lag, because it's hard to get, say, bigger companies to do those things. So you need technologists out there building these things.
I mean, I think the public is missing from the current moment. So there's a lot of these choices. Once again, like if you don't have solar technology, you don't have wind, you don't have, nuclear power, you don't have alternatives to oil, you can't really talk about a sensible climate change policy. You need to think about it. How do I do this? You need to talk about public transportation. So you need stuff that works, that aligns with the values that the public holds. But very often, what we have is the public is given, this is why I don't really like GDPR, a moment choice. You're lost. Are you going to give your location to Google Maps or not? And of course, yes, because it is in my personal momentary interest to turn over my location. I'm lost. But it is not in the public's interest to have a company have 3 billion people's live location. That is a dangerous accumulation of power. That is not in the public's interest. So I sort of think of it like, what does the public want isn't like a pointless consent, click, click, click at the moment, but it is the representatives of the public, which they have not yet done, creating the kind of policies that gives the public the choices that align with the public interest, not in some moment, but in terms of the long term. Like you don't give kids ice cream for breakfast and then lunch and then dinner and they say that's what they want, right? Like that, of course that's what they want then. So we don't have the implementation at scale. And while DuckDuckGo is one sort of successful example, like Secure Enclave is, I think, one example. I think WhatsApp becoming end-to-end encrypted, a little complicated, but it's another thing, right? One company, all of a sudden you had a certain level of privacy, even with the complications. So those are, we need the public, really, like our representatives need to be pushed, I think, to push the companies and change the incentives to create the possibility for implementations that will be viable, profitable, successful for the public. I think we're underestimating how much our policymakers are not on board with this problem.
Yeah, go ahead.
Very quickly, so completely agree. The public needs to be more involved in all of this discussion and decision-making, especially in the era of generative AI. We've seen these technologies come up, and the assumption is that there will be product market fit, as opposed to designing backwards from what it is we know that the public is looking for, what people are looking for. I'm not speaking about Meta in particular here. I'm talking industry-wide. But I also don't want to undersell the kind of work, in part, that's grown out of some of the missteps and the errors that were made in previous generations. The work that's being done to try and bring the public in more, not just by working with regulators, but through direct democracy efforts. So one thing that I'm proud of that Meta does now, we've started running these community forums, partnering with Stanford and a few other educational institutions, where we bring together in these ideal deliberative polling exercises people to come talk about how it is they would use the technology, what are the kinds of policies they would create for generative AI, what are the values, how would they manage conflicting value systems. And that's not enough. But I do think it's worth mentioning that there are more of these efforts, and again, coming out of a history of perhaps not having done enough of it, even less of it previously.
Yeah. So one last question for the audience, and I'll give you one to wrap up with. But one question, Pablo, and I'll direct it to you, given all your different roles, which is, one, and it picks up on Zeynep's point, is the public could also fund things, right? So how do we better fund and defend infrastructure? Is there some role for the government to fund this? Should the government be thinking of spending money to build public interest technology?
Is that a commercial for the work that CITP is doing on digital public infrastructure? I'm super happy to promote that. But I will say that it's it's something that I've been looking at in my work at CNES, and the way that I've been focused on it is in the context of kind of so-called sovereign AI with nation states funding the development of models, as well as funding the development of infrastructure to train and deploy the models. There's a very, very kind of serious, I think, global debate precisely about this. And I'll just give, for example, Canada as an example. So you wouldn't imagine that Canada would be kind of like, well, perhaps you would be, think of Canada as focused on this. But essentially what the Canadian government is thinking about doing is spending $1.5 billion US on essentially kind of new kind of supercomputing capacity loaded up with H100s, et cetera. And the reason that they're thinking about that is because they are, one, concerned about access to foreign cloud providers' infrastructure. Essentially, they're kind of worried about kind of like getting rate managed out of using compute capacity. But then I think more deeply, they're thinking about kind of like the equitable distribution of compute and being in a stronger position to kind of decide that NGOs, research organizations, hospitals, and other startups and other entities that have kind of less access to compute, that the government should have kind of a say in that. In the public interest, right? In the national interest. And so these are experiments that are being kind of like run right now. India, by the way, is another example. They have this kind of 10,000 GPU program that they're investing in. And we will see. We will see how all that plays out.
Great. So we'll just give concluding thoughts as we go down the just couple minutes total. So just a thought or two on what motivates you to continue your work right now. What has been the source of motivation?
For me, it's just, continuing. Basically, we keep increasing customers' privacy and more people are coming online and learning about these things. And that's just constantly been motivating for me.
It's hard to say at the moment because now I have a great job. Like I can hardly complain. But I can tell you what motivated me when things were really unclear. And this is why I keep talking to the young people here, because I have great hopes, is that if you come from a tech background, you'll find a way to make living quite likely. If you come from a social sciencey background, you should learn some tech anyway to be like informed in this field. And it will also be a plan B in terms of the potential jobs. And what really is super motivating, and I said this and I did this for years, even when it really wasn't clear that I would end up with the great job I have right now, is that it is very rewarding. It is intellectually interesting. It is challenging. You're not, you're not just sort of selling ads. You're not just doing that kind of mediocre work for the world, to be honest. Like Google is still funded by ads and they do other stuff, but that's what they do. That's the company. But you can do really interesting things and make a living quite plausibly in a fulfilling way. And possibly, like he was saying, you could find your work really influential, but you're not going to know that. You shouldn't really do it like that. You just sort of, I think enjoying the effort is very motivating and rewarding. And I want to tell like all these sort of grad students and undergrads that I know, they're like, I see them in the room, that it is absolutely plausible. It won't be as big a salary as the other path, but it will be intellectually fascinating, interesting, challenging, great, and maybe you'll make history or be part of making history in a very good way. So that, to me, I think is very motivating by itself.
I mean, I think I have the best job in all of tech, honestly, and probably one of the best jobs that a philosopher has ever been paid for, right? This is the beginning. It's not the beginning of AI. AI has been around for decades, starting at Dartmouth. I look at Susan, but it is this age of a newer kind of AI that's, and to have the opportunity to be at the table as a philosopher, to be asking these kinds of fundamental questions, not just what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be a human who interacts with machines? How are they going to change us? How do we change them? What is autonomy? What is speech that's worth protecting? How do we cause harm? How do we avoid causing harm? These like fundamental questions. Getting to do that at the beginning of a technology's development cycle, as opposed to coming in afterwards, right? As opposed to coming in and trying to make things better once they've gone wrong. And I'm not saying that we're going to get it right perfectly, having ethics or that perspective baked in from the start. But to get to try is incredibly exciting and rewarding. And I wake up every day really happy that I get to do this kind of work.
Let's just have Pablo.
I mean, I guess I think you were asking like what gets me up in the morning. That's kind of a longer conversation. I would need a couch, but I would, I would say that I mean, just like for you all, I was really inspired by the lightning rounds that you guys did. I saw in each one of those lightning rounds, kind of kernels of, kind of larger policy debates, and also kind of like, kind of potential future where, the tech policy outcomes are actually more positive just simply because of the people who are involved. And so, I would just simply like conclude by saying that, yes, this is kind of what I do for a living, but I think that objectively speaking, tech policy is becoming kind of one of the very, very central areas of policy from, U.S. government perspective, from a broader, international perspective. Not only that, but tech policy, even in kind of the non-tech world, is becoming more and more central. So if you really kind of want to be part of, kind of like the future and influence it, this is kind of the place to be. And again, I'm like super happy to see that so many of you are motivated by this and are going into this and are going into it with the right mindset of kind of thinking about this kind of ethically and from the perspective of the public good. So just, keep going. And I'm on LinkedIn, so if you want to, get in touch with me, I'm super happy to talk after this. But I really thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you to everyone on the panel.
I'm just incredibly grateful to all the speakers and moderators, both in this panel and throughout the day. Let me tell you, frankly, I mean, my expectation was that if we heard a lot of things today that are inspiring and useful for people who are getting into the field, that would have been a success for me. I think what we heard today went way beyond that. I've been in tech policy for 15 to 20 years, and everything I heard was interesting to me. And there were no platitudes spoken today. And so I thought that was really, really wonderful. Really appreciate all of you taking the time to come here and speak to us today. Running a conference like this is a big production. There were so many people behind the scenes, our executive director, Titi Chattopadhyay, our staff, Jean Butcher, Laura Cummings-Abdo, Lydia Owens, our emerging scholars, Sam Hafferty, Nithya Nadgir, Sophie Luskin, our IT person, Patrick Rakiki, photographer, David Kelly Crow, many people working in building services, our student workers. Really thank you to all of you. This was such a smoothly run conference. I hope everyone here took something away, enjoyed the day. And the last thing I want to say is that I do think the words that were spoken today are going to live beyond today. The videos are going to be online, but also, like I was mentioning earlier, we're going to write a conference report, and I'm sure that these materials are going to be useful to me as I think about, new scholars at CITP and training them. And I hope that if you're an instructor, you take advantage of the materials that have been created and are going to live online in the way that you educate new folks in tech policy. And so with that, thank you, everyone. There are going to be refreshments outside, right? Yeah, there's a reception outside. You'll have time to mingle with all the speakers and among each other. Thank you again for coming, and goodbye. Thank you.